I ended the last lecture by outlining very briefly what I saw as the three key elements of church life. The truth, the proclamation of the truth, the nature or worship, and the code. In the book, Desecration of Man, I alliterate, I talk about the creed, the cult, and the code. Cult being a slightly unfortunate word in English because we use the same word for worship, cult, as we also use for sort of crazy religious groups that take over your life and kidnap children, that kind of thing. But cult here, I specifically mean the form of worship. So let's think then about the creed. First of all, the Christian understanding of truth, I think, flies very much in the face of the modern understanding of truth. For Christianity, the truth is the truth regardless of the instrumental effect that it has. If I were to use sort of technical language, I would say that the modern self, the modern person, tends towards a view of truth as instrumental. Truth is that which is useful to achieve certain ends. Again, thinking of I did a fair bit of work some years ago on critical theory, and the Hungarian Marxist philosopher George Lukács has this passage where he talks about truth, and he really says we have to reconstitute how we think about truth. Truth is not referential. Truth is that which leads us towards the desired result. In other words, a statement becomes true not if it actually reflects reality, but if it disrupts reality in such a way that allows for something better to emerge. That's become, I think, the intuitive notion of truth today. Truth is that which achieves an end, not that which describes reality. For the Christian faith, however, truth is that which describes reality. And it finds its expression in the Christian creed, or in Christian doctrine, or in Christian dogma. If in your church on a Sunday you recite the Nicene Creed, you recite something that stands at the very center of what Christianity means, a statement of the identity of God Himself and an outline of His saving actions. What's also interesting about the Nicene Creed, and you find this in more elaborate forms in many of the great creeds and confessions of the church. If you're a Lutheran, you find it in the Book of Concord. If you're a Presbyterian, you find it in the Westminster Confession. If you are Reformed, you find it in the Belgic Confession. These things bring out the interconnection of Christian truth. It's not that Christianity is a set of isolated truths. It's a complex whole that stands together as a whole. And that's important for understanding anthropology. Think about it. If human beings are made in the image of God, then a correct understanding of what it means to be human rests or is related to a correct understanding of God Himself. One cannot understand the full implications of being made in God's image if one doesn't have an understanding of who God is. That's why, I would say another reason why the church is the place where humanity can be reconsecrated. Because the church, in teaching about God, actually teaches anthropology as well, because of the connection that exists between God and God's image. Now, I want to just elaborate on Christian teaching or the nature of Christian teaching today in light of where I started my first talk. My first talk I started by saying it behooves the church to find the issue of the day and be particularly attentive to that issue in the way that it teaches. I want to suggest that if the issue of the day is what it means to be human, if the issue of the day is anthropology, then Protestants have to rethink, to some degree, how they teach the whole counsel of God. What do I mean by that? Well, it seems to me that the most specific challenges on the doctrine of God are the moral challenges. The challenges, let's say, faced by, well, everything from human sexuality and gender, through to reproductive technology, through to artificial intelligence. All of these things pose challenges to what it means to be human. Now, typically, the way of Protestants addressing moral challenges is to find a text that deals with those challenges. So, if the challenge is, should I commit adultery? Easy one. There's a text, thou shalt not commit adultery. Very easy moral challenge to address. Should I steal my neighbor's property? No. There's a text that addresses that. Thou shalt not steal. But when you get questions being raised today about anthropology, about what it means to be a human, many of those issues are not susceptible to texts. I have not seen the details of the storm that my book apparently triggered in Norwegian Christian circles. I think the issue was vasectomies. I don't even mention vasectomies in my book, but somebody is connecting some dots. But let's take vasectomy as an obvious example, or as a clear challenge that's come up in the Norwegian church. What is the text that addresses it? There is no biblical text that addresses it. Does that mean that the Bible has nothing to say to the issue? I would suggest not. One cannot assume that because the Bible does not explicitly address something, the Bible has nothing to say to that issue. Now, this is not to come down on one side of that argument or the other, but it is to say the way that argument is to be addressed cannot be by proof text. It has to be addressed in a different way. And I would suggest the way it has to be addressed is this. We have to build a rich understanding based upon the Bible of what it means to be human, so that we can then ask from these various moral challenges when they arise, are they consistent with a biblical understanding of what it means to be human, or do they contradict a biblical understanding of what it means to be human? This, I think, is why so many of us in the Protestant world have found ourselves very dependent upon Catholic moral teaching in the last few decades, because that's actually the way that the Catholic Church has tended to address moral issues, coming in it from a strong anthropology that does not depend upon specific proof texts for specific moral problems. Don't understand me as they're giving a imprimatur on all of Catholic moral teaching. But it is to say that the approach, the method they use, is one that we can, I think, benefit from tremendously. I've said this numerous times in public lectures, but I think one of the best books, for example, on human love and marriage is John Paul II's book, Love and Responsibility. I don't know of a Protestant book that deals with marriage in the same depth and, frankly, with the same beauty that the former Pope did. Not to put an imprimatur on every line in that book, certainly not to put an imprimatur on everything John Paul II said or taught. But it is to say there's something there that we can learn from. We need to develop a more holistic understanding of how to do our moral teaching. I think it has to arise out of thoroughgoing catechesis. It's important that the whole counsel of God is taught. But I would say to any of you out there who are ministers, elders, Bible study leaders, fellowship group leaders, you need to think about moral challenges in a broader way. Don't assume that every question that your students or your congregants are going to ask you is susceptible to a straightforward, look up this text and that gives you the answer. You may have to spend more time articulating what it means to be a human being. And I would say one of the things that we have lost in Protestantism, that's there in our tradition and we can certainly recapture, is, to use the technical term, teleology. The human beings are created with an end. It's there in my own Presbyterian tradition. Shorter Catechism, question 1. What is the chief end of man? Answer, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And there I think we get a clue as to how to do our moral thinking. Does this challenge frustrate or deny man's God-given end, or does it enhance it and strengthen it? Does it move us closer to God, or does it deflect us from God? That's very different to thinking about proof texts. I faced this a number of times. I teach 18 to 22-year-olds. That's the greatest age group to teach. They've just left home. They're starting to think for themselves. And they're wanting to find the answers for themselves. So my students are open to being given good arguments. What I've noticed is some of them will come into my office and say, what does the Bible teach about, let's say, homosexuality? And I'll send them to some texts. And I can see their minds working, saying, yeah, I see what the texts say. But do the texts say that because God has arbitrarily decided that He wants a certain section of humanity to be permanently lonely and unhappy? I have to give them a richer answer for the biblical texts to make sense. I have to set them in the context of a broader anthropology so they can see that God does not just arbitrarily say, do this and don't do that, but it makes sense in terms of how He's put together the whole of the created universe. So, that's one thing. We need to think in holistic terms, and maybe we need to revise the way we do our moral teaching in order to equip people to think through the difficult issues of our day. Secondly, and this is really for the preachers out there, it's also for those who listen to preaching. I spend far more time listening to preaching these days than I do preaching. Remember, preaching is not just explaining the Bible. If you want the Bible explained to you on a Sunday, stay home and read a commentary. Commentaries will probably do it better than your pastor does. What is preaching? Preaching is God speaking to His people through the voice of the pastor. Preaching is a theological act. Second Helvetic Confession of 1566 says, Article 1 says, we believe that when the Word of God is correctly preached by those properly called to the office, it is the very Word of God. And the Latin is very strong there. It is the very Word of God. The catechist, the confession writer, Heinrich Bullinger, is not there proclaiming that the sermon is infallible. No, search the scriptures to see that the things being proclaimed are so. But he is putting great weight on the preaching act as that moment when God confronts His people. Preaching is proclamation. When you go to hear preaching, expect God to speak to you. Expect to be transformed, but here I'm going to qualify transformation a little. Don't expect every Sunday to be transformed instantly. Expect to be transformed over months and years. I've spent a lot of time, people come to me and say, I struggle to remember sermons I've heard preached. My answer is always, I struggle to remember sermons I've preached. I'll have students say to me, what do you think of 2 Corinthians chapter 3? And I'll say, well, I preached on that 10 years ago. Let me go and look at my notes, and I'll tell you what I believe about it. The purpose of preaching is not instant transformation every Sunday. The purpose of preaching is incremental transformation over a lifetime. I can speak some basic French. I have pretty decent Latin and Greek. Why? I studied them at school and then I did Latin and Greek at university, went on and continued university. Don't remember a single French lesson, Latin lesson or Greek lesson in my entire life. I must have been there because if you show me a page of Latin text, I can read it. I was transformed over the decades that I studied it. Preaching is like that. Preaching transforms us over time. Catechesis, finally. Catechesis has to demonstrate the coherence of the whole. Again, don't try and do your moral teaching in isolation from the rest of doctrinal teaching. Teach morality in the context of the whole of the gospel. Second, cult, right worship. I'd say this about worship. Well, first of all, I'm not here to say you've got to worship this way and not another. Every church will have its own particular ways of worshiping, but every legitimate form of Christian worship has to take some things into account. First of all, I think the very structure of the worship service has to take account of the truth being taught. The great English writer, friend of C.S. Lewis, Dorothy L. Sayers, has this statement where she says, people are very tired of dogma these days, but don't they realize that the dogma is the drama? And she's trying to bring out there the fact that Christian truth is not dry. It's dramatic. And where is this drama brought out more thoroughly than in worship? I would say our worship should reflect what it means to be human. Various aspects of the image of God, but I think one of the aspects of the image of God is we're rational. We're creatures who think things through and move ourselves intentionally along. Worship should make sense, in other words. When you leave worship on a Sunday morning, you should be able to understand what the connection was between the things you heard, the things you sang, and the things you prayed. Worship should be rational. It should be personal. It should address you. It should be, to use that word again, teleological. It should have an end, a goal. Teleology is this idea, of course, that the end shapes the beginning. When I hopped on the plane in Heathrow the other day to come to Oslo, the first thing I thought about as I was making my way to the gate was Oslo. Don't want to get on a plane to Dubai. Don't want to get on a plane to Istanbul. Nothing against Istanbul or Dubai. Wonderful places. But I'd got to be in Oslo. That's where my hotel reservations are. That's where I'm speaking on Saturday. No point in being in Istanbul if I'm not in Oslo. And yet the last thing I did on Thursday was what? The last place I arrived was Oslo. First thing I thought about, shaped everything I did that day, and was the last place I arrived. Teleology. It means that the end should shape everything we do in worship. What is the end? To glorify God and enjoy Him. Ultimately enjoy Him forever. I might also add a sort of twist to this and say, maybe the end is also preparing for death. It's interesting that in Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, and Anglicanism, the liturgy for Sunday evening prayers has a place near the end for the Nunc Dimittis, Simeon's song, now let your servant depart in peace. Think of that scene in the New Testament. Simeon is there in the temple. Mary and Joseph come in carrying the baby Jesus. Simeon sees the one that God has promised that he would see. He sees the Messiah. He knows that God has finally acted, taken human flesh, and come to bring about the end of history. And what's his immediate response? Let me die. Now I'm ready to die. It makes sense. The Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican liturgy sort of end with a Nunc Dimittis, because what's supposed to go on in the worship service? You're supposed to meet with the risen Christ. And when you meet with the risen Christ, you should be prepared to die. Easier said than done. Man, I'm as terrified of dying at the end of a Sunday service as I am at the beginning. But that's down to me. The Sunday service should be teleological, pointing you towards the end. It has to direct us outward, not inward. I said early on, about institutions become places of performance rather than places of formation. Worship is to form us. That's not to say that our own feelings don't count in worship. An example I would give of the Bible makes clear allowance of that. One of my favorite psalms is Psalm 73. To my great delight, I think the first sermon I ever heard on it was last Sunday. A good friend of mine was preaching at the church where my wife and I worship, and he just happened to choose Psalm 73. If you go back and look at it, you'll know the psalm. It's the psalmist is looking really at how all of the wicked people seem to prosper. They laugh at God and they prosper. And this has a deep effect on the psalmist. He uses very strong language. He says, my feet had almost slipped. He's talking about his anger and his resentment and his jealousy. And he says, my feet had almost slipped. I almost lost faith. The psalm, in other words, the first part of the psalm is saturated with the psalmist speaking about his own feelings. But then there's a gear change. He said, until I went to the sanctuary, until I gathered with the people of God in the place where the people of God worship. For him, that was the sanctuary, where the Ark of the Covenant was, where God in covenant met with his people. And then their end became plain. You see what's happened to the psalmist. He's been formed. Yes, performance has not been rendered illegitimate. He's been very honest in his expressions about how he feels. But ultimately, he has brought those feelings under the authority, under the external authority of the revealed God. He's allowed his gathering with the people of God to form him in a powerful way. Another piece, a wonderful piece of psalmody is Psalm 88, the most depressing psalm in the book. If you read it carelessly, you'll think it's a psalm without any hope at all, because it ends with the Lord taking the poor psalmist's friends away from him. But if you go back to the beginning of the psalm, you'll notice one key word that the psalmist uses. He uses the covenant name of God. I don't know if it's the same in Norwegian translations of the Bible, but in English translations of the Bible, the convention is that the covenant name of God in the Old Testament is always capitalized. So you know it's not just a generic word for God or Lord, it's the covenant name. He uses the covenant name of God. All of his agony being performed in the psalm is brought under the authority of the covenant God. I love Augustine's Confessions. Augustine's Confessions is the first psychological autobiography. It's all about Augustine's feelings. But read carefully, you'll notice this. The whole thing is an address to God. It's one long prayer to God. And at the end, all of Augustine's thoughts are shaped by the external reality of God, specifically God as he's acted in Christ. Worship is to form us. It's not to stop us expressing our feelings, but it is not to terminate with the expression of our feelings. It is to bring those feelings round, to bring them under the external authority of God, and to make them into that which is consistent with his truth. I would suggest the order of worship is important as well. It was implicit in some ways in what I said about teleology. The church that I go to, we have a call to worship. We're called into the presence of God. We have an opening prayer asking for God's blessing upon the gathering. At some point, we'll have a reading of the law, followed by a confession of sin, followed by a reading of the promise of the gospel. There'll be a pastoral prayer for the congregation as a whole. There'll be a proclamation of the word, and then we'll be dismissed with a blessing. There's an order of worship. The gospel itself, if you like, is dramatized by the order of worship. And that's important. We're shaped as much, human beings, we're shaped by rituals, not just by words. Think of the difference between, do you have McDonald's in Norway? I apologize. It's the difference between eating a Big Mac and going to a nice restaurant and sitting down and ordering a burger from a nice restaurant. Think about it. In both scenarios, you replace calories. You replace calories. It's important. Human beings replace calories or we die. But think about eating a meal with your loved ones. That shapes you. I love to ask the students at Grove, how many of you have been on a serious first date? I'll put up their hands and I'll say, and where was it? And 99 times out of 100, it involves food. It is not insignificant that the first important date typically involves sitting at a table, eating food. Why? Because rituals shape who we are and how we think. All creatures have to replace calories. Only we have restaurants. Only we have dining rooms. Only we take time to prepare food so that it looks good as well as tastes good. My late great Jack Russell Terrier, he loved his food. No meal that ever lasted more than 30 seconds. And often, 2 out of 3 meals were then thrown up and re-eaten in a rather disgusting fashion. We don't do that. Why not? Because we're creatures of ritual. Worship is ritual that shapes us. It's important that the way we worship is thought about carefully, because that's as formative. What we do in worship can be as formative as what we hear. Think about the words you find easier to remember, the Bible or the hymns you sing. Hymns are much easier to remember because they're connected to tunes. Brain remembers words connected to music differently. Singing is critical. When I was writing the desecration book, I came across this fascinating research that an Anglican friend of mine directed me to about how simply communally singing makes you a better person. How? Well, apparently when you communally sing in any context, you feel greater affinity with the people you're singing with than you would otherwise. It's why I imagine the Norwegians are the same, but the English, we sing at sports matches. It's a way of being part of the team. It's a way of identifying, sympathizing with others. Singing in worship is transformative. It makes you understand yourself less as an isolated individual and more as part of a whole. You sing as an individual, but you have to follow the tune that everybody follows. You have to be part of the group as an individual. Your freedom is expressed through your belonging when you sing. Sacraments. I think the sensuous nature, particularly of the Lord's Supper, baptism also. The Lord's Supper is a meal. I've already said meals are incredibly important. Lutherans, Reform, Baptists, we're all going to disagree on exactly what's going on in the Lord's Supper relative to Christ's presence. But the fact that it's a meal is something we can all agree on and see as significant for forming the Christian community. And think of the importance of being there as bodies. I've not really addressed this today, but one of the acts of desecration in which we engage, I think, regularly in the modern world is an increasing downplaying of the importance of the body. We tend to think of ourselves as inhabiting our bodies rather than being our bodies. Embodiment, embodied worship is critical. Just being there with other people makes a difference. And that brings me, thirdly and finally, to the last section, that of code. We had the creed, we've had cult, we've had worship. Now we have the code, the development of the right moral habits. Well, first of all, we need to develop moral habits that reflect what it is to be made in the image of God. And to be made in the image of God is to be dependent upon God and dependent upon one another. Obliged to and dependent upon each other. So we need to develop habits and intuitions that reflect that. We need to belong to the right group, in other words. Augustine has this, it's one of my favorite passages in the Confessions. Confessions book 2, when he describes how he and a group of his pals broke into a neighbour's garden one night and stole a load of pears and ran off with them. And the pears were foul. They got better pears at home. So they stole these pears and fed them to pigs. And he raises a couple of interesting questions about this. One, why did I do it if I got no benefit from it? And he comes to the conclusion, well, the benefit I got from it was the fun of breaking the rules. We all went off laughing. He said it was just great fun to break the rules, to feel like God. But he also said, but I wouldn't have done it if I was on my own. I did it because I was part of a group. My wife and I have 2 sons, good guys. Neither of them ever really wandered off the straight and narrow. We never worried when they were out on their own. We only ever worried when they were out with their pals. The moral sum of a group of young men is always less than the moral sum of the parts. Young men behave worse and worse the more there are of them. They drag each other down. Paul talks about this, doesn't he, when he says bad company corrupts morals. The way to cultivate good moral intuitions is to be part of the right group, to be part of the church. We are created as social creatures. We are to cultivate social habits. We're to reflect in our lives and in the way we speak and act our obligations towards others. It's very striking to me that the Didike, possibly the earliest text we have that didn't make it into the New Testament. Traditionally, it was thought to be written by the 12 apostles. That's certainly not the case. The Didike, this early text, consists of 2 halves. The second half is really a primitive liturgy, but the first half is a series of moral regulations. And among those moral regulations is this: to be a member of the church is to be somebody who doesn't engage in abortion or infanticide. Fascinating. And I want to suggest to you that was a tremendously potent evangelistic stance in the early church. If you bear with me at this point, but we'll go towards the end of the 2nd century, there is a very strong critic of the church, a man called Celsus, who writes this critique of Christianity. And one of the things he says about the church is this: if you go to their assemblies, they're full of women. Full of women. Well, maybe that's just a bit of anti-Christian propaganda. But I think Celsus is actually telling the truth there. Why? Well, think about it. If you have a society that routinely engages in abortion and infanticide, who suffers most? Women. Baby girls. Certainly in the ancient world, count for less than baby boys. We have a dramatic letter written by a Roman soldier in Egypt to his wife. And in his letter he says, I hope the pregnancy goes well. When you have the baby, if it's a boy, bring him up to be strong and brave. If it's a girl, throw her out on the rubbish heap. Quite dramatic. Now think about it. If you have 4 or 5 generations of a community that doesn't kill its infant girls, what will it look like compared to the broader culture? I would say the subculture will have a higher proportion of women to men than the broader culture does. So anybody looking in from a pagan world to a church assembly, and let's say seeing 50-50 men and women, he'll think, man, that's completely dominated by women. If the sociologist Rodney Stark is correct, that's one of the things that makes the church very attractive in the ancient world. Because eventually, women cottoned on to the fact they were better protected in the community of the church than in the wider society. How we live as a church, I think, can be one of the most powerful tools for demonstrating what it means to be human. And that should be an encouragement. Not many are called to be philosophers. Not many are called to be theologians. Not many are called to have elaborate arguments to answer some of the elaborate arguments being put out there in secular society. But everybody in the church can be kind. Everybody can behave with respect towards other human beings. Everybody can speak up for the weak and vulnerable. It won't change things by the middle of next week, but over time it will produce communities of consecrated human beings who are what humans should be, and that will be attractive to those who are raising very serious questions at this point in time about the dehumanization that is taking place in the secular world. And I would then, and with this I will conclude and say one of the most simple ways that can be done is hospitality. I was speaking at a high school graduation just a week ago in America. Wonderful group of 18-year-old kids. And I suspect the teachers were slightly shocked by how I started this, but they sort of approved by the end. But I basically said to these kids, 30 years from now, you'll not remember a single class you ever attended at school or at college. You won't. Because over time, they will not be the most important things in your life. But I said, what you will remember is this. You will remember the teachers and professors who opened their homes to you and were kind to you. And you will remember the people you sat next to in class who became your friends. Because kindness and hospitality strikes a deep, resonant chord that lasts a lifetime. So my third element, the code, is this. Let us as churches put hospitality at the center of our practical lives. We're told that Western society at the moment is subject to a pandemic of loneliness. People are even making friends of chatbots. Talking, I always thought, talking to imaginary friends was something I did when I was 2 or 3. Then I met real friends, and the imaginary friends no longer counted for anything at all. We seem to be in reverse today. People have so few friends that the imaginary friend is becoming a helpful substitute. How much more powerful will those people find it to find real friends, real hospitality in the church? And you might say, well, but that's not the gospel. And I would say, well, no, gospel is what's proclaimed on a Sunday. But I would also add that I don't care why somebody comes to church on a Sunday. I really don't. As long as they do come to church on a Sunday, where they get a chance to hear the gospel and to be formed by the worship of God. And I really do think that hospitality is within the reach of most people and will prove to be very, very potent in the witness of the church in the coming age of dehumanization. For what is the more humanizing than hospitality? Think of that terrible chapter in the Old Testament, Judges 19, which begins as a comedy. You know, the Levite's trying to get away from his father-in-law, and his father-in-law keeps throwing parties for him until finally, there's an excess of hospitality. Finally, the Levite gets away with his concubine, and they come to a city, a pagan city, but they won't stop there because it's not a city inhabited by the people of God. They go on to a city where the people of God are. And they enter the town square, and suddenly the mood changes. If it was a movie, first half of that would be a kind of, you've watched those movies where you think it's a comedy, then suddenly the music changes and you realize, no, this is actually a horror film. Judges 19, it's a comedy. And then they arrive in the town square. And what does the text say? And nobody took them in. The people of God are to be marked by hospitality. I am the Lord your God, who is a hospitable God. You too, therefore, should be hospitable. You know that something's gone horribly wrong with the people of God at that point, because nobody takes them in, nobody's hospitable. And it's followed by one of the most horrific and explicit scenes in the whole of Scripture. Hospitality is key, and it's within the grasp of everybody, and it's the way for most of us of humanizing those who feel dehumanized by the world around them. Thank you for listening so patiently. I think there's a time now for some Q&A.